When dawn breaks over Pittsburgh, black smoke already covers the city like a shroud. Inside, Carnegie steel's furnaces, where molten metal glows at 2,900 degrees, men work 12-hour shifts without breaks, 7 days a week, for wages that barely buy bread. The air tastes like sulfur and coal dust. The ground trembles with massive hammers pounding white-hot steel. Workers emerge from night shifts with faces blackened by soot, coughing up blood they've learned not to mention. Andrew Carnegie built something no one had seen before, a machine, a system, an empire that turned iron ore into money faster than any man in history. But empires aren't built with speeches and handshakes. They're built with fire, with bodies that break and don't get counted. The question isn't whether Carnegie changed America. He did. The question is simpler. Was it worth what it cost, and who decided they were willing to pay? The year is 1848, Scotland. A 13-year-old boy named Andrew Carnegie boards a ship with his family, fleeing poverty in Dunfermline, heading for Pennsylvania with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They settle in Allegheny, just outside Pittsburgh, in a cramped apartment above a weaver's shop. His father, William, a skilled handloom weaver who once commanded respect and decent wages, can't find work in a country already replacing craftsmen with machines. The textile mills don't need weavers anymore. They need bodies to tend the machines. His mother, Margaret, takes in laundry and mending, working 16-hour days for pennies. Andrew becomes a bobbin boy in a textile mill, 12-hour days for $1.20 a week. He's small for his age, quick with his hands, sharp in ways that make older workers nervous. The work is monotonous, the pay is insulting, but the boy watches. He learns something most people miss. In America, capital matters more than labor, and proximity to power matters more than talent. Pittsburgh in 1848 is nothing like the industrial giant it will become. About 50,000 people. Small foundries dot the riverbanks. Steamboats belch smoke along the waterways. The smell of coal and iron hangs in the air, mixing with wood smoke and river water. But the geography is perfect for what's coming. Water for transport, coal for fuel. Rivers that connect to the Mississippi, to New Orleans, to markets across the continent. Carnegie arrives too young to understand the opportunity, but not too young to feel the energy, the sense that this place is building toward something. At 14, he becomes a telegraph messenger for the O'Reilly Telegraph Company, running messages across Pittsburgh for $2.50 a week. It's a step up, barely, but it puts him in contact with businessmen, lawyers, merchants, people who make decisions that move money. He memorizes addresses, learns who matters, teaches himself to read telegraph code by staying late, watching the operators, practicing on spare equipment. At 15, he's operating the telegraph himself. At 17, Thomas Scott, superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Western Division, hires him as his personal telegrapher and assistant. Scott becomes his mentor, his door to something bigger. By 24, Carnegie is Scott's right hand, handling contracts, investments, inside information that turns into personal fortune. Scott shows him how the game works. You don't make money working, you make money owning. Railroads need iron for rails, wood for ties, coal for fuel. If you own pieces of those supply chains, you profit whether the railroad succeeds or fails. Carnegie starts small, borrows money, invests in a sleeping car company, makes his first real money. Invests in oil fields in Pennsylvania, turns $1,000 into dividends that dwarf his railroad salary. Invests in iron foundries, bridge companies, anything connected to the railroad boom that's about to explode. Everything compounds. By 1860, at 25 years old, Andrew Carnegie is worth $50,000. Nearly $2 million in today's money. Built entirely on borrowed capital and inside knowledge. The Civil War arrives in 1861, and while men die at Antietam and Gettysburg, Carnegie manages military railroads and telegraph lines from a safe distance. He's appointed by Scott, now Assistant Secretary of War, to organize transportation and communication for the Union Army. It's logistical work, critical work, but safe work. No combat, no battlefield. He watches the government pour money into infrastructure, into steel for weapons, into the machinery of industrial warfare that will reshape the continent. Railroads become military tools. Telegraph lines carry orders that decide battles. Iron foundries work around the clock producing cannons, rails, armored plating. The war is teaching America how to industrialize at scale. Carnegie is watching, learning. After the war, America explodes. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connects the Atlantic to the Pacific for the first time. Thousands of miles of track punch through mountains and across plains, creating a national market that didn't exist before. Every mile requires steel, hundreds of thousands of tons. The demand is insatiable. Carnegie sees the future before it arrives. He's made money in railroads, in oil, in iron. But he understands something deeper. The men who supply the railroads will make more than the men who run them. Raw materials beat transportation. Manufacturing beats services. In 1865, he founds the Keystone Bridge Company, building iron bridges to replace the wooden structures that keep collapsing under the weight of heavier trains. Bridges are perfect, expensive, essential, government-funded. Every railroad needs them. Every city wants them. The projects are massive, profitable, and they teach him something crucial about scale. Big projects need big capital. Big capital needs big returns. In 1873, he visits England and sees the Bessemer process in action, a technique that turns molten pig iron into steel faster and cheaper than anything America has. He returns obsessed. Henry Bessemer patented the process in 1856, but American iron makers have been slow to adopt it, stuck in old methods, afraid of the investment required. Carnegie sees opportunity in their fear. He sells his other investments, raises capital, and in 1875 opens the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, just outside Pittsburgh. He names it after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, John Edgar Thomson, a customer he needs to keep happy. The location is strategic: rivers for transport, coal nearby, railroad connections, and something else: immigrant labor flooding in from Europe, desperate for any work at any wage. The Edgar Thomson Works is massive from the start. 5 Bessemer converters, rail rolling mills, blast furnaces, the capacity to produce 225 tons of steel rails per day, more than any facility in America. The investment is enormous, over $1 million. But Carnegie understands the logic: dominate or die. If you're not the cheapest, you're irrelevant. The Bessemer process is violent, brutal, beautiful in its efficiency. You pour molten pig iron into a massive pear-shaped converter, 15 to 25 tons at a time. Then you blast compressed air through the bottom at high pressure, burning out impurities, carbon, silicon, manganese, in a shower of sparks and flame that lights up the night sky for miles. The reaction is so intense it generates its own heat, reaching temperatures over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit without any external fuel. The converter glows white-hot. The noise is deafening. A roar like a continuous explosion. In 15 to 20 minutes, you've turned pig iron into steel. Before Bessemer, making steel was slow, expensive, a craftsman's art done in small batches. After Bessemer, it's industrial, scalable, profitable beyond imagination. But the process demands bodies, human fuel. Workers who can endure heat that melts skin, noise that ruptures eardrums, shifts that never end. The furnaces run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Steel doesn't wait. Furnaces that cool down lose money. Downtime is death. Carnegie hires immigrants: Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Italians, Croatians. Men who speak no English, who arrive in America with nothing and will accept anything. They live in company housing, cramped wooden structures near the mills, where families of 6 or 8 share 2-room apartments with no running water, no indoor plumbing, no heat except what comes from the mills. They shop at company stores where prices are inflated and wages are paid in scrip that can't be spent anywhere else. 12-hour shifts, alternating between day and night every 2 weeks. The long turn, the shift rotation, means working 24 hours straight every other Sunday, from midnight Saturday to midnight Sunday, without rest, without breaks, nothing but the relentless rhythm of production. No overtime, no safety regulations, no workers' compensation. If you lose a finger, you lose your job. If you lose your life, your family loses everything. The company provides nothing, no death benefits, no pensions, no insurance. Your widow gets evicted from company housing within days. Your children, if they're old enough, get hired to replace you at half the wage. The system is efficient, cruel, but efficient. By 1880, Carnegie Steel produces more than any American competitor. The Edgar Thomson Works alone produces 100,000 tons of steel rails annually. Carnegie opens a second facility, the Homestead Steel Works, in 1881, after buying out a struggling competitor. Homestead is larger, more versatile, capable of producing structural steel, not just rails, beams for bridges, girders for buildings, armor plating for warships. By 1890, Carnegie's operations are producing more steel than most countries. By 1900, Carnegie Steel produces 3 million tons of steel annually. Profits exceed $40 million a year, nearly $1.5 billion in today's money. The company controls 25% of American steel production. Carnegie's personal net worth climbs past $300 million, making him one of the richest men on the planet. Richer than the Rockefellers, richer than European aristocrats whose wealth comes from centuries of inheritance. But numbers don't bleed. Numbers don't bury their children. Numbers don't explain what happens inside the mills when the sun goes down, and the only witnesses are men, too tired or too scared to speak. The work kills slowly and quickly. Slowly through exhaustion, through lungs destroyed by coal dust and metal particles, through joints worn down by repetitive motion, through bodies aged decades by labor that never stops. Quickly through accidents that happen every shift. A ladle tips, spilling molten steel across the floor, incinerating anyone in its path. A cable snaps, sending tons of metal crashing down. A man slips on a floor slick with sweat and oil, falls into machinery that doesn't stop. An explosion in the blast furnace sends shrapnel through flesh. The heat alone kills. Heat stroke, heart failure, organs shutting down because the body can't regulate temperature anymore. In summer, temperatures inside the mills reach 130, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men drink gallons of water and still collapse. Some don't get up. The official records are incomplete, deliberately vague, but estimates from labor historians suggest that in Carnegie's mills, one worker died every day. Every single day, over 3,000 deaths between 1890 and 1910, though the real number is likely higher because many deaths weren't reported. Burns, crushes, falls, explosions, drownings in quenching tanks, electrocutions, asphyxiation from gas leaks. The bodies were cleared quickly. Production couldn't stop. Families were notified by supervisors who delivered the news without ceremony, without apology, sometimes without even the correct name. Your husband is dead. Your father is dead. Move out of company housing by Friday. Children worked the mills too. 10, 11, 12 years old, small enough to crawl into spaces adults couldn't reach, quick enough to dodge machinery that didn't slow down for anyone. They carried scrap metal, cleaned slag from the furnaces, ran messages between shifts, hauled buckets of water to workers who couldn't leave their stations. The work aged them fast. Childhood didn't exist here, just survival. Pennsylvania had child labor laws on paper starting in 1889, prohibiting children under 13 from factory work. But enforcement was a joke. Factory owners paid fines that cost less than hiring adult workers. Inspectors, often paid off, looked the other way. Families needed the income. A child's wage, however small, meant the difference between eating and starving. Carnegie rarely visited the mills. He spent most of his time in New York, managing investments, attending dinners, cultivating relationships with bankers and politicians. Or in Scotland, at his estate in Skibo Castle, a massive property he purchased in 1897, playing the part of the enlightened industrialist, the immigrant success story. The self-made man who proved America was the land of opportunity. He wrote essays about the responsibilities of wealth, published in popular magazines, read by millions. He preached the gospel of wealth, arguing that rich men had a moral duty to give back, to use their fortunes for the public good, to serve as stewards of civilization. The man who accumulates great wealth has an obligation, he wrote, to distribute it for purposes that benefit humanity. To die rich, he claimed, was to die disgraced. He donated money to libraries, thousands of them, 2,509 by the time he died, across America, Britain, Canada, Australia, anywhere English was spoken. He funded universities, endowed research, built concert halls and museums. His name became synonymous with philanthropy, with generosity, with the American dream made real. But the money came from Homestead, from Braddock, from Edgar Thompson, from men who would never read the books in his libraries because they couldn't afford the time, the education, or the hope. The contradiction didn't bother him, or if it did, he never showed it. He believed in efficiency, in systems, in the idea that competition forced innovation, that the strong survived and the weak deserved their fate. Social Darwinism dressed up as economic theory. The fittest would rise. The market would decide. Government intervention was unnecessary, even harmful. Let capitalism run its course, and society would benefit from the wealth generated at the top. That wealth would trickle down eventually. The workers were a necessary input, like coal or iron ore. You used them efficiently. You replaced them when they broke. Sentiment was a luxury businesses couldn't afford. In 1889, he published The Gospel of Wealth in the North American Review. The problem of our age is the proper administration of wealth, he wrote, so that the ties of brotherhood may still bind together the rich and poor in harmonious relationship. The argument was seductive. Rich men shouldn't hoard their fortunes. But they shouldn't give them to the poor directly either. Direct charity creates dependency. Instead, the wealthy should fund institutions that help people help themselves. Libraries, schools, concert halls, parks, not handouts, but opportunities. The essay made him famous beyond business circles. It made him respectable, moral, a thinker as well as a builder. Universities invited him to speak. Presidents sought his advice. He became a symbol of enlightened capitalism, proof that the system worked. But the essay never mentioned Homestead. It never mentioned the 12-hour days, the 7-day weeks, the children in the mills, the widows begging in the streets. It never asked why the men creating the wealth couldn't afford to feed their families. In 1892, the contract between Carnegie Steel and the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers was set to expire. The union represented about 800 skilled workers at the Homestead Mill, the men who controlled the most critical processes, the ones who couldn't easily be replaced. They weren't radicals. They weren't demanding revolution. They were asking for wages that kept pace with Carnegie's profits. For safer conditions, for a voice in decisions that determined whether they lived or died, the company was making record profits. 40 million in 1891 alone. The workers wanted a share, not an equal share, just more than survival. Carnegie publicly supported labor rights. He'd written articles years earlier condemning companies that exploited workers. He'd praised unions as necessary checks on corporate greed, as organizations that gave workers collective power they couldn't achieve individually. But privately, in letters to his partner, Henry Clay Frick, he wanted the union gone. Unions slowed production. Unions cost money. Unions meant negotiations, compromises, limits on management's ability to cut wages and increase hours whenever market conditions changed. Carnegie wanted flexibility, total control. He left for Scotland in spring 1892, putting Frick in charge with clear instructions: break the union, do whatever it takes. Henry Clay Frick had built his fortune in coke, the coal product that fueled steel furnaces, supplying Carnegie's mills and others across Pennsylvania. He was a millionaire by 30, ruthless in business, cold in demeanor, a man who saw workers as expenses on a ledger, variables to be minimized. He'd crushed strikes before. He knew the playbook: cut wages, lock out the workers, hire replacements, wait for them to starve. The union would collapse, it always did. In June, Frick announced new terms for the contract: wage cuts across the board for skilled workers, longer hours, and a take-it-or-leave deadline. The union refused. They had leverage, or thought they did. Homestead was profitable. Carnegie needed the output. Surely he'd negotiate. But Frick wasn't negotiating. On June 28th, he announced a lockout. On June 30th, he locked the gates. 3,000 workers, union and non-union alike, found themselves on the outside, staring at a factory surrounded by a new fence, 3 miles long, 15 feet high, topped with barbed wire and watchtowers. The workers called it Fort Frick. The message was clear: you're replaceable, all of you. The workers didn't leave. They set up camps outside the mill, organized patrols, watching the river and the rail lines for any sign that Frick was bringing in replacement workers. They established a command structure led by Hugh O'Donnell, a union organizer who believed this could be won without violence if they stayed united. The town supported them. Shopkeepers extended credit. Neighbors shared food. Homestead was a company town, but it was also a community, and the workers were fathers, brothers, sons. Their fight was everyone's fight. Frick didn't wait. On July 2nd, he contacted the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a private security firm that specialized in strike-breaking, in violence dressed up as law enforcement. The Pinkertons had a reputation. They'd broken strikes in mines, in railroads, in factories across the country. They were hired guns with badges, mercenaries who operated in legal grey zones. Frick hired 300 of them, armed with Winchester rifles and pistols, with orders to take control of the Homestead mill by force and hold it until replacement workers could be brought in. On the night of July 5th, the Pinkertons boarded 2 barges on the Monongahela River, heading toward Homestead, under cover of darkness. The plan was simple: land at the mill's dock, secure the perimeter, intimidate the workers into submission. But someone saw the barges. A watchman, a fisherman. Word spread through town like fire. By 4 a.m., when the barges reached the dock, thousands of workers and their families were waiting on the riverbank, armed with rifles, shotguns, hunting weapons. The Pinkertons tried to land. The workers opened fire. The Pinkertons fired back. For 12 hours, gunfire echoed across the river. Men fell on both sides. Women threw boiling water from the banks. Children hurled stones and scrap metal. Someone tried to float a burning raft toward the barges. Someone else poured oil on the river and tried to ignite it. The Pinkertons, pinned down on their barges, couldn't advance, couldn't retreat, couldn't do anything but fire back and hope for reinforcement that never came. By late afternoon, the Pinkertons surrendered. White flag. Ceasefire. They agreed to leave if the workers let them go unharmed. The workers agreed, but as the Pinkertons disembarked and marched through town toward the railroad station, the crowd, furious, exhausted, grieving, attacked. They beat the Pinkertons with fists, with clubs, with anything at hand. Women struck them, children spat on them. By the time the Pinkertons reached the train, many were bloodied, bruised, humiliated, stripped of weapons and dignity. The workers had won. 10 people were dead, 7 workers, 3 Pinkertons, dozens wounded. The victory was brief. Pennsylvania Governor Robert Patterson declared martial law. On July 12th, 8,000 National Guard troops arrived, declared Homestead under military occupation, and seized the mill by force. The workers, exhausted, outgunned, outnumbered, went home. There was nothing left to do. Frick hired replacement workers. Mostly immigrants who didn't speak English, didn't know about the strike, didn't have a choice. Production resumed within days. The union leaders were arrested, charged with murder, tried in front of judges who made no pretense of neutrality. Most were acquitted, but it didn't matter. The union was destroyed. Members were blacklisted, their names circulated to every steel company in the region. They couldn't find work anywhere. Families were evicted from company housing. Men who'd worked at Homestead for decades found themselves unemployed, unmarketable, erased. Carnegie, in Scotland, sent Frick a telegram. "Congratulations on your success in handling the workers." He never publicly acknowledged the violence. He never visited Homestead again. He never spoke the names of the men who died. In private letters, he expressed regret, not for the deaths, but for the publicity, for the damage to his reputation as a friend of labor. The gospel of wealth suddenly looked hollow. How could a man who preached charity preside over a massacre? Newspapers asked the question. Editorials condemned him. Labor organizations burned him in effigy. But Carnegie had money. Money buys silence. Money rewrites history. He doubled down on philanthropy, donated more, built more libraries, more schools. Within a few years, the public narrative shifted. Carnegie the industrialist became Carnegie the benefactor. The bodies at Homestead became footnotes. Progress requires sacrifice. That's what people told themselves. The human cost of Homestead went beyond the dead and wounded. It broke something in American labor. For decades, workers had believed they could organize, could negotiate, could push back against industrial power with collective action. Homestead proved them wrong. It proved that in the end, capital had guns, and labor had nothing. The message spread. Other companies saw what Carnegie did and copied it. Strikes were crushed with hired security. Unions were dismantled. Wages stagnated or fell. The Gilded Age wasn't golden for everyone. For most it was iron and blood. The steel kept flowing. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was producing 25% of all American steel. The factories ran on a rhythm of exhaustion and efficiency. New technologies increased output. The open hearth furnace, introduced in the 1890s, allowed for better quality control. Electric cranes replaced manual labor in some tasks. Rail networks connected mines directly to mills. Carnegie's vertical integration strategy meant he controlled every step. The mines that produced iron ore in Minnesota, the ships that transported it across the Great Lakes, the railroads that delivered it to Pittsburgh, the coke ovens that provided fuel, the mills that turned ore into steel, the fabrication plants that turned steel into finished products. He owned the entire supply chain, no middlemen, no inefficiencies, maximum profit. Workers learned not to complain. The ones who did were replaced. The ones who stayed survived on stubbornness and prayer. Injuries were constant, routine, expected. A government report from 1907, conducted by the U.S. Bureau of Labor, found that nearly 25% of steelworkers were injured annually. Most injuries went unreported. Reporting meant medical bills the company wouldn't pay. It meant losing your job. So men worked through broken bones, through burns that covered half their bodies, through fevers that should have killed them. They worked until they couldn't, and then someone else took their place. In 1901, everything changed. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America, wanted to consolidate the steel industry into a single monopoly. He'd done it before with railroads, with electricity, with banking. Steel was next. He approached Carnegie with an offer: sell. Name your price. Carnegie was 65, tired, ready to spend his remaining years giving away his fortune, cementing his legacy as something other than an industrialist who'd built an empire on exploitation. He consulted with advisors, considered options, and settled on a number: $480 million paid in bonds, the equivalent of $15 billion today, the largest private buyout in history at the time. Carnegie accepted. On March 2, 1901, the deal closed. Carnegie Steel became part of U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. Morgan created a trust that controlled 67% of American steel production, a monopoly so vast it terrified competitors and lawmakers alike. But Carnegie didn't care. He was out. He was rich beyond measure. He was free to pursue what he'd always claimed mattered most, giving it all away. He moved permanently to Scotland, to Skibo Castle, a sprawling estate with over 40,000 acres, servants, groundskeepers, a private golf course, all the trappings of aristocracy he'd once despised. He spent the rest of his life writing, speaking, lecturing about the moral obligations of the wealthy. By the time he died in 1919, at 83, he'd donated $350 million, nearly 90% of his wealth, building 2,509 libraries, funding universities, Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Institute of Technology, endowing research, the Carnegie Institution for Science, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, supporting the arts, Carnegie Hall in New York. History remembers him as a philanthropist, a visionary, a self-made man who embodied the American dream. But what about the men who made the steel? What about the widows of Homestead? What about the children who grew up without fathers? The families who lost everything so Carnegie could buy immortality? They didn't get libraries. They got graves. Unmarked graves in most cases, because funerals cost money and the company didn't pay for burials. The workers who survived didn't retire to castles. They retired to poverty, to bodies broken by decades of labor that no amount of philanthropy could heal. Their lungs destroyed by coal dust, their joints fused from repetitive motion, their hearing gone from years of noise. Carnegie's generosity was built on their suffering. Every brick in every library he funded was paid for with their sweat, their blood, their silence. U.S. Steel continued Carnegie's model: the same long hours, the same low wages, the same disregard for human life. It took decades for labor laws to catch up, for unions to gain legal protection, for workplace safety to become more than a suggestion. The steel industry didn't change because companies suddenly discovered compassion. It changed because workers fought. Because journalists exposed conditions that couldn't be hidden forever, because public outrage, sustained over years, forced politicians to act. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which banned child labor and mandated overtime pay, didn't pass until 1938. 37 years after Carnegie sold his company, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which enforces workplace safety, wasn't created until 1970. 70 years after Carnegie sold his company, the government finally acknowledged that workers deserved protection from the conditions he'd normalized. Progress was slow, painful, bought with lives that shouldn't have been necessary but were. Pittsburgh grew rich on steel, the city's skyline, its bridges, its reputation as the industrial heart of America, all built on the same foundation. By the 1920s, Pittsburgh was producing half of the nation's steel, employing hundreds of thousands of workers across dozens of mills. Smoke choked the air so thick that streetlights stayed on during the day. People wore white shirts to work and came home with them gray. Rivers ran orange with industrial runoff, heavy metals, chemical waste that killed fish and poisoned drinking water. The city's life expectancy was lower than the national average. Cancer rates, respiratory diseases, birth defects, all elevated. The environmental cost of steel production wasn't theoretical, it was measurable, visible, deadly. But steel meant jobs, jobs meant survival. So people accepted the smoke, the pollution, the sickness, because the alternative was starvation. The decline was inevitable. By the 1970s, American steel couldn't compete. Foreign producers, especially Japan and Germany, rebuilt after World War II with modern technology, government subsidies, and lower labor costs. Japanese mills used basic oxygen furnaces, newer, more efficient than the open-hearth furnaces American companies still relied on. American companies, fat on decades of monopoly profits, hadn't reinvested in modernization. U.S. Steel's aging mills, many still using equipment from Carnegie's era, couldn't match the efficiency. Jobs disappeared. Mills closed. Entire towns built around steel production became ghost towns overnight. Homestead, once home to 20,000 workers, saw its population collapse. The mill that defined the town shut down in 1986. The buildings were demolished. The land sat empty for years, contaminated with heavy metals, arsenic, lead, chemicals that seeped into soil and groundwater, making it worthless for development, dangerous for human habitation. Braddock followed the same path. By the 1980s, the town's population had fallen from 20,000 to 4,000. Unemployment hit 25%. Buildings were abandoned, schools closed, churches shuttered. The people who remained were the ones who couldn't leave, trapped by poverty, by age, by the simple fact that no one wanted to buy property in a dying town. The Edgar Thomson Works still operates today, one of the last remnants of Carnegie's empire, employing a fraction of its former workforce. Automated, efficient, producing steel for a fraction of the cost with a fraction of the people. Today, if you visit Pittsburgh, you'll find a city that's moved on. Tech companies, universities, medical centers. Google, Uber, Amazon all have offices there. Carnegie Mellon University, founded with Carnegie's money, is a world-class research institution. The rivers are cleaner than they've been in a century. The air is breathable. Fish swim in the Monongahela again. The old mill sites have been redeveloped into shopping centers, office parks, condos, for people who have no idea what stood there before, what happened in those buildings, what was sacrificed to build the foundations of the city they enjoy. There are museums now. The Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area preserves fragments of the industrial past, offers tours of abandoned mills, explains the history to tourists who take photos and leave. The exhibits are sanitized, safe. The violence is edited out. The deaths are statistics. The suffering is context. Carnegie's libraries still stand. More than 1,600 of them across the United States, still serving communities, still offering books and programs and hope to people who need them. Their beautiful buildings, grand architecture, marble columns, reading rooms with high ceilings and natural light, his name carved in stone above the doors. People walk in every day, grateful for the resource, unaware of the cost. Or maybe aware, but willing to accept the transaction. There's a plaque at the site of the Homestead strike, a small marker on a street corner near where the mill once stood, near the waterfront shopping complex that replaced it. It mentions the battle, lists the names of some of the dead. 7 workers, John Morris, Silas Wayne, Henry Striegel, George Rutter, Joseph Sotak, Peter Fares, and Isaac Davis. 3 Pinkertons, Edward Connors, J.W. Klein, and T.C. Connell. It doesn't explain why it happened. It doesn't ask whether it had to happen. Plaques don't ask questions. They commemorate. They simplify. They let you feel like you've acknowledged something without actually confronting it. The people who visit read the words, take a photo if they remember, move on. The past stays past, but some things don't stay buried. In 2017, researchers analyzing Carnegie's personal letters at the Library of Congress found correspondence that directly contradicted his public persona. Private notes to Frick, written in May 1892, 2 months before the Homestead strike. We must teach these workers a lesson they won't forget. Instructions to cut costs regardless of consequences, dated 1891. Wages, workers, safety measures, whatever it takes. Profits must increase. The letters reveal a man who understood exactly what he was doing, who made deliberate choices to prioritize profit over people, who constructed a public image designed to obscure the truth. The gospel of wealth wasn't gospel. It was marketing, a way to control the narrative, a way to be remembered as a saint instead of what he was, a man who built an empire on the backs of people he never had to see, never had to know, never had to mourn. The steel industry's legacy is complicated. It built America, literally. The bridges you drive over, the buildings you work in, the infrastructure that makes modern life possible, the railroads that connected a continent, the ships that won wars, the skyscrapers that defined cities. None of it exists without steel. None of it exists without the men who made it. Carnegie's innovation, his ruthless efficiency, his ability to scale production beyond what anyone thought possible, those things mattered. They changed the world. But change isn't neutral. It has a price. When you walk into a Carnegie library, what are you walking into? A gift, a monument to generosity, or a transaction, a building purchased with suffering, a legacy built on silence. Carnegie believed wealth came with responsibility. He believed the rich owed society something, but he also believed he got to decide what that something was. He got to choose libraries over fair wages, monuments over safety, legacy over justice. The workers at Homestead didn't get to choose. The irony is almost too perfect. Carnegie spent his final years writing, speaking, lecturing about the moral obligations of the wealthy. He argued that a man who dies rich dies disgraced. He gave away nearly everything. He funded peace initiatives, education programs, scientific research. He wanted to be remembered as the man who proved capitalism could be humane, that wealth could serve the greater good. But humane capitalism built on inhumane labor is a contradiction that no amount of philanthropy can resolve. You can't erase the past with donations. You can't buy redemption. You can only buy a better story. And maybe that's enough. Maybe history doesn't care about contradictions. Maybe it only cares about outcomes. Carnegie's libraries educate millions. His endowments fund research that saves lives. The workers at Homestead are dead. Their suffering is over. Does it matter anymore? Does guilt pass down through generations, or does it expire with the guilty? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the questions every society has to answer when it decides what to remember and what to forget. Pittsburgh remembers steel. It remembers Carnegie. It remembers progress. The museums celebrate innovation, efficiency, industrial might. The tours explain the technology. The exhibits show how America became a superpower. But the workers are background, names on a list, numbers in a report. The system that killed them is described as unfortunate, a product of its time, something we've moved past. As if moving past something erases it, as if progress excuses the cost. There's a final number worth mentioning. In 1919, when Carnegie died, his estate was worth approximately $475 million. He'd given away $350 million, leaving $125 million to his wife and daughter. In today's money, that's nearly $2 billion. The richest man in the world, even after giving away 90% of his fortune, still left more wealth than most countries. The workers at Homestead, the men who made that fortune possible, left nothing. No estates, no endowments, no legacies. Just children who inherited poverty and the knowledge that their fathers built something they'd never own. The Homestead mill is gone. The factories are demolished. The smoke has cleared. Pittsburgh is green now, clean, livable, a city that reinvented itself after the industry that built it collapsed. The past is preserved in museums and plaques and carefully curated narratives that make progress feel inevitable, necessary, even noble. And maybe it was. Maybe you can't build a modern world without breaking a few generations. Maybe Carnegie's libraries justify the suffering. Maybe the equation balances. Or maybe we just tell ourselves that because the alternative is too uncomfortable to confront. When you stand in front of a Carnegie library, look at the stone, the columns, the carved name above the door. Think about where it came from. Not metaphorically, literally. Think about the furnaces, the 12-hour shifts, the men who lost fingers, arms, lives. Think about the children carrying scrap metal in heat that would kill grown men. Think about the widows begging in streets outside the gates of mills their husbands died building. Think about the silence that followed every death, the funerals held quietly, the graves dug quickly, the production that never stopped. Then decide, is this a monument to generosity or a gravestone for people who never got one? The question isn't whether Carnegie changed America. He did. The question is whether the change was worth the price and who got to decide they were willing to pay. History gives us the facts. It doesn't give us the answers. That part is on us. We inherit the libraries and the bridges and the wealth generated by a system that consumed human beings as fuel. We benefit from the progress built on their sacrifice. We get to choose whether we acknowledge the cost or whether we accept the story we've been sold, the one where progress always wins and the price is always worth paying. If you want to explore more stories about the empires built on invisible labor, the monuments erected on unmarked graves, the legacies we celebrate without questioning what they cost, let me know in the comments. What place should we examine next? What foundation should we dig beneath? History doesn't judge, but maybe we should. The workers who survived Carnegie's empire carried scars that never healed, not just the physical ones, though those were everywhere in Pittsburgh. Men missing fingers, missing hands, burns that left skin twisted across faces and arms, backs bent from decades of lifting, shoulders permanently hunched, lungs that rattled with every breath, coughing up black phlegm. These were the visible costs. But the invisible scars ran deeper, the psychological toll of working where death was random and routine, where you watched friends die and kept working, where you knew with absolute certainty that if you died tomorrow, someone would be doing your job by next week, and your family would be on the street by next month. That kind of precarity changes a person. It breaks something fundamental. The sense that your life has value, that your labor deserves dignity. The immigrant experience made it worse. Most workers spoke little or no English when they arrived. They came from Poland, from Hungary, from Italy, from places where survival meant accepting whatever work existed. They were sold a dream, America, opportunity, a fresh start. What they found was exploitation dressed up as progress, company towns where they had no power, no voice, no rights. The ethnic divisions were deliberate strategy. Carnegie and his managers understood that unified workers were dangerous workers. So they hired diverse immigrant populations, mixed them together, ensured language barriers prevented organizing. A Polish worker couldn't strategize with an Italian worker if they couldn't communicate. Different ethnic groups were assigned different tasks, creating hierarchies, resentments. The English-speaking workers got the skilled positions, the slightly better pay. The newer immigrants got the worst jobs, the hottest, most dangerous work. Women rarely worked in the mills directly, but they carried different burdens. The wives of steel workers ran households on wages that barely covered rent and food. They stretched pennies into meals, mended clothes until fabric fell apart, took in laundry or sewing or boarders to make ends meet. They raised children in company housing that was overcrowded, unsanitary, dangerous. They buried husbands and sons killed in mill accidents, often with no compensation, no support, no acknowledgement beyond eviction notices. When strikes happened, when lockouts lasted weeks or months, women organized soup kitchens, stretched food supplies, held communities together through sheer force of will. The Homestead Strike of 1892 wasn't just workers fighting, it was families fighting, entire communities. When the Pinkertons arrived on those barges, women were on the riverbank, throwing boiling water, hurling stones, standing alongside their husbands and brothers and sons. They understood what was at stake. Not just wages, not just working conditions, their entire way of life. After the strike failed, after the National Guard occupied Homestead and production resumed, the repercussions spread through generations. Children grew up watching their fathers broken by work or blacklisted from it. They internalized lessons about power, about class, about the value the world places on certain lives versus others. Some became unionists, radicals, fighters who spent their lives pushing back. Others internalized the defeat, accepted that resistance was futile, that survival meant keeping your head down. The mythology around Carnegie grew in inverse proportion to the forgotten stories of his workers. As the decades passed, as the people who remembered Homestead firsthand died, the narrative simplified. Carnegie became the self-made immigrant who embodied the American dream, the boy who arrived with nothing and became the richest man in the world. Schools taught his story as inspiration. Textbooks mentioned Homestead as a footnote, if they mentioned it at all. But the pattern Carnegie established didn't disappear. It metastasized. Other industries adopted his model. Vertical integration. Union busting, exploitation of immigrant labor, minimal safety standards. The prioritization of profit over human welfare became standard practice across American industry. The meatpacking plants of Chicago, the textile mills of Massachusetts, the coal mines of West Virginia, different products, same system. The progressive era, the period from roughly 1890 to 1920, brought some reforms. Child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, the 8-hour workday for some industries. But these changes came slowly, fought tooth and nail by industrialists who argued regulation would destroy American competitiveness. Carnegie himself opposed most labor reforms, even as he donated millions to libraries. The contradiction was stunning. He'd fund schools where children could learn, but fight laws that would let them stay children long enough to attend those schools. Journalists played a crucial role in exposing conditions that companies worked hard to hide. Muckrakers, they were called, writers who dug into corporate practices and published what they found in popular magazines. Ida Tarbell exposed Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair exposed the meatpacking industry. John Fitch exposed the steel industry, publishing detailed accounts of working conditions in Pittsburgh mills in 1910. 12-hour days, 7-day weeks, industrial accidents that killed thousands annually. His reporting created public pressure that eventually forced reforms. But by then, Carnegie was long gone, insulated in Scotland, writing his memoirs, polishing his legacy. The First World War created massive demand for American steel. U.S. Steel, now the dominant producer, couldn't keep up. Factories ran at maximum capacity. Workers were pushed even harder. The promise was that wartime sacrifice would be rewarded with better conditions, better pay, recognition of labor's essential contribution. But after the war ended, steel companies cut wages instead of raising them. In 1919, 365,000 steel workers across the country went on strike, demanding the 8-hour day, 1 day off per week, union recognition, and decent pay. The strike lasted 3.5 months. It failed. Companies brought in replacement workers, used police and private security to break picket lines, ran propaganda campaigns that painted strikers as radicals and anarchists. The lesson of Homestead repeated on a national scale. The Great Depression devastated steel towns. Demand collapsed. Mills closed or reduced production to skeleton crews. Unemployment in Pittsburgh hit 30%. Families that had barely survived in good times faced starvation in bad ones. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Soup kitchens ran out of food. Shanty towns, Hoovervilles, sprang up on vacant lots where men lived in makeshift shelters built from scrap metal and cardboard. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. They'd spent their lives making steel, and now they lived in shelters made from the scraps. The New Deal brought some relief: public works programs, Social Security, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, which gave workers the legal right to organize and bargain collectively. These were victories, hard-won, paid for with decades of struggle. But they came too late for the men who died in Carnegie's mills, for the families destroyed by Homestead, for the generations who suffered while industrialists accumulated wealth. By the 1940s, with World War II creating another surge in demand, steel unions finally gained real power. The United Steelworkers of America, formed in 1942, represented hundreds of thousands of workers. They negotiated contracts that improved wages, reduced hours, established safety standards. The post-war period, from 1945 to the early 1970s, was the golden age of American industrial labor. Union wages allowed workers to buy homes, cars, send children to college. The middle class expanded. The promise of American capitalism seemed briefly to be delivering for working people. But that era was an aberration, not the norm. By the 1970s, globalization and automation began eroding the gains labor had made. Steel companies, faced with foreign competition, started closing plants, moving production overseas, investing in technology that required fewer workers. The unions that had seemed powerful discovered their power was contingent, dependent on employers needing their labor. When employers found cheaper alternatives, labor lost its leverage. The decline was brutal and fast. Homestead's final death came in 1986 when U.S. Steel closed the mill permanently. The company cited foreign competition, declining demand, aging infrastructure, but the truth was simpler. They could make more profit elsewhere. The workers who'd given their lives to that mill, who'd followed their fathers and grandfathers into those furnaces, found themselves discarded. Some were offered transfers to other facilities, most weren't. At 50, 60 years old, with bodies destroyed by decades of brutal labor, they were unemployable. Their skills were obsolete. Their pensions, if they had them, were inadequate. Many died within a few years of heart disease, lung disease, cancers that may or may not have been caused by workplace exposure. The mill building sat empty for years. Massive structures, hundreds of feet long, brick and steel monuments to an era that ended without ceremony or gratitude. Vandals stripped them. Weather deteriorated them. They became dangerous, unstable. Eventually, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they were demolished. Imploded, reduced to rubble. The land underneath was contaminated. Decades of industrial production had saturated the soil with heavy metals, chemicals, toxins that would take generations to remediate. A developer bought the land, cleaned it up minimally, and built the waterfront shopping complex. Opened in 1999, it's a mall like any mall. Chain stores, restaurants, a movie theater. People shop there who have no idea what stood there before. Teenagers work part-time retail jobs on ground where their great-grandfathers may have died. The transformation is complete, history erased, memory sanitized, but some people remember. The Homestead Strike Foundation, a small non-profit, works to keep the history alive. They maintain the memorial marker. They organize annual commemorations. They give talks at schools, fighting against the sanitized version of history that textbooks prefer. They collect oral histories from the children and grandchildren of steelworkers, voices that remember what their parents or grandparents told them about life in the mills. These stories are fragmentary, incomplete, filtered through time and trauma. But they're important. They resist the erasure. Carnegie never expressed real remorse. In his autobiography, published posthumously in 1920, he mentions Homestead briefly, defensively. He claims he was in Scotland and uninvolved in the decisions Frick made. He suggests the violence was regrettable but necessary, that unions were unreasonable, that the market required efficiency. He spends far more pages describing his philanthropic work, his libraries, his commitment to world peace. The autobiography is a masterclass in image management, in shaping how history will remember you. And it worked. For most people, Carnegie is the library guy, not the homestead guy. The philosophical question at the heart of Carnegie's legacy is this: can good done with ill-gotten wealth redeem the getting? If you steal $1 million and donate it all to charity, are you a thief or a philanthropist? Carnegie would argue the question misses the point. He didn't steal anything. He followed the rules of capitalism as they existed. He paid workers what the market demanded, no more, no less. His responsibility was to shareholders, to efficiency, to growth. But that argument assumes the rules of capitalism are natural laws, immutable and neutral. They're not. They're human constructs, designed by and for people with power. Carnegie had enormous power over those rules. He lobbied against labor protections. He funded politicians who opposed regulations. He used his wealth to shape the legal and political environment in ways that protected his interests. You can't claim you're just following the rules when you're the one writing them. Modern corporations inherited Carnegie's playbook. The language has changed. They don't call it exploitation anymore. They call it efficiency, disruption, shareholder value. They don't hire Pinkertons. They hire union-busting consultants, anti-labor law firms. They don't pay in scrip. They pay minimum wage and call it opportunity. The mechanisms are more sophisticated. The PR is better, but the fundamental logic remains. Labor is a cost to minimize. Profits are the only metric that matters. Amazon warehouse workers, monitored by algorithms, pushed to unsustainable productivity levels, denied bathroom breaks, injured at rates far higher than industry average. Uber and Lyft drivers, classified as contractors to avoid providing benefits, working 70-hour weeks to make poverty wages. Fast food workers, paid so little they qualify for food stamps, while the companies they work for generate billions in profit. The details change. The pattern doesn't. And when these workers try to organize, try to demand better conditions, they face the same resistance Carnegie deployed: threats, intimidation, replacement. The law protects organizing in theory. In practice, enforcement is weak and companies know it. Carnegie's libraries can't be unmade. The books they contain have educated millions genuinely. The research they enabled has contributed to human knowledge, genuinely. But accepting the good they do doesn't require erasing how they were funded. Both things can be true. The libraries are valuable and they're blood money. Carnegie was brilliant and he was brutal. Progress happened and people suffered. We can acknowledge complexity. We can hold contradictions. What we can't do, what we shouldn't do, is pretend the cost wasn't paid, or that it was necessary, or that it's all behind us now. Because it's not behind us. The systems Carnegie helped build still function. The assumptions he operated under still dominate economic thinking. The belief that markets are efficient, that concentrated wealth is earned, that success justifies any method, that regulation destroys innovation, these ideas shape policy, shape culture, shape what people believe is possible or fair or right. Carnegie didn't create these beliefs, but he embodied them perfectly, and his success gave them credibility. Look what can be achieved, people said then and still say now, when you let capitalism work without interference. The workers at Homestead are the interference being removed. There's a statue of Carnegie in Pittsburgh, erected in 1938 during the Depression. It stands in front of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, which he founded and funded. The statue shows him seated, dignified, thoughtful, a man of contemplation and learning. The inscription reads, "My heart is in the work." It doesn't specify which work, the libraries or the mills, the philanthropy or the profits. If you visit the statue, you'll probably see tourists taking photos. Carnegie Museum is popular. Natural history, dinosaurs, minerals, educational, fun for families. The statue is just part of the landscape, unremarkable. But if you stand there long enough, if you think about where the money came from to build that museum, to purchase those collections, to fund that research, you start to see it differently. Not as a monument to generosity, as a monument to transformation. Raw material in, finished product out. In this case, the raw material was human labor, and the finished product was cultural capital. The question we should ask, standing in front of that statue, isn't whether Carnegie was a good man or a bad man. Moral binaries are inadequate for understanding historical figures who existed in different contexts with different constraints and opportunities. The question is what we learn from his example. What it tells us about capitalism, about wealth, about power, about whose lives get valued and whose get used. Whether we're comfortable with a system that produces Carnegie and Homestead as two sides of the same process. Some people are okay with it. They argue progress requires sacrifice, that someone had to work those mills, someone had to take those risks, and the fact that it was Carnegie who profited and anonymous immigrants who died is just how the market allocated roles. Luck, timing, skill. Whatever combination determines success or failure. Carnegie built something. He created value. He transformed raw materials into products that enabled American growth. That growth lifted living standards eventually, even for workers. The long arc bends toward justice, or at least prosperity. Other people aren't okay with it. They see Homestead as evidence that unfettered capitalism is fundamentally predatory. That without strong regulations and worker power, employers will always maximize profit at the expense of human welfare. They see Carnegie's philanthropy as insufficient, performative, a way to launder a reputation built on exploitation. They argue that true justice would have meant fair wages while workers were alive, safe conditions while they were working, dignity while they were producing the wealth Carnegie then gave away for credit. Both perspectives contain truth. Both oversimplify a complex historical reality. Carnegie existed in a time before labor laws, before safety regulations, before the legal frameworks we now take for granted. Holding him to modern standards is arguably unfair. But Carnegie himself claimed to hold enlightened views, claimed to believe in social responsibility, claimed to care about worker welfare. Judging him against his own stated principles is entirely fair, and by that measure, he failed catastrophically. The disconnect between his words and his actions, between his public persona and his business practices, between the gospel of wealth and the reality of Homestead, that disconnect is damning regardless of historical context. The legacy question extends beyond Carnegie personally. Every major American fortune from the Gilded Age was built similarly. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, Vanderbilt and railroads, J.P. Morgan and banking. These men accumulated wealth on scales previously unimaginable by monopolizing industries, crushing competition, and extracting maximum value from labor while compensating it minimally. They all became philanthropists. They all have universities, hospitals, museums bearing their names. They all claimed they were serving the public good by accumulating wealth and redistributing it strategically. And in some ways, they did serve the public good. The institutions they funded have value. The research they enabled has contributed to human flourishing. But we can acknowledge that while also questioning whether that was the most just or efficient way to achieve those outcomes. What if instead of allowing individuals to accumulate hundreds of millions in wealth and then choose how to give it away, we taxed those fortunes and invested democratically in public goods? What if workers had been paid enough to afford education, healthcare, housing without relying on the charitable whims of the people exploiting them? These aren't just historical questions, they're current questions. Today, billionaires fund philanthropy on scales that dwarf Carnegie, Gates, Bezos, Musk. They fund global health initiatives, climate research, space exploration. They claim, like Carnegie did, that concentrated wealth in the hands of smart people who deploy it strategically serves society better than democratic redistribution. And maybe they're right. Maybe billionaire philanthropy is more efficient than government programs. But efficiency isn't the only value worth considering. Justice matters. Democracy matters. The question of who gets to decide how wealth is used matters. When Bezos decides to fund space exploration instead of raising warehouse worker wages, when Musk buys Twitter instead of improving Tesla factory conditions, they're making choices about social priorities that affect millions of people who have no say in those choices. Carnegie would have understood. He made similar choices. Fund libraries, not wages. Build concert halls, not safer factories. Support universities, not unions. And he'd argue these were better choices, that institutions last longer than individual workers, that investing in education lifts society more than paying higher wages ever could. He believed in trickle-down before the term existed. Homestead suggests otherwise. The workers who died in his mills didn't benefit eventually. Their children, barred from education by poverty and child labor, didn't benefit. Their grandchildren, inheriting broken bodies and economic precarity, didn't benefit much. Maybe their great-grandchildren benefit now in a society that's wealthier and safer than 1892. But that's a lot of generations to wait, a lot of suffering to endure for someone else's eventual gain. The mills are gone, the smoke is gone, the workers are dead, and their children are dead. Pittsburgh is green and clean and livable. Carnegie's libraries stand, his museums welcome millions. His name is synonymous with philanthropy. The story we tell ourselves is that it worked out, that progress happened, that America became the richest, most powerful nation on earth, and everyone benefits from that. And maybe they do, in aggregate, in averages that smooth out individual tragedies into statistical noise. But standing in Homestead, looking at the shopping mall built on bones, reading the names on that small plaque, it's hard to feel like it worked out. It's hard not to wonder if there was another way. If the same industrial growth could have happened without the 12-hour days, the 7-day weeks, the children in the mills, the Pinkertons on the barges. If Carnegie could have made 100 million instead of 300 million, and the workers could have made enough to feed their families. If profit and dignity could have coexisted, maybe not. Maybe the early industrial period required exactly that level of exploitation to generate the capital that enabled later development. Maybe Carnegie's ruthlessness was necessary, his workers' suffering unavoidable, the whole bloody process an essential stage in economic evolution. Or maybe that's just the story we tell ourselves to justify outcomes we benefit from, to avoid confronting the violence baked into systems we participate in, to sleep well in a world built on foundations we'd rather not examine too closely. History doesn't answer. It just records. The furnaces burned, the steel flowed, the men died. The libraries opened, the smoke cleared, the city changed, and here we are, inheritors of both the libraries and the graves, beneficiaries of both the progress and the suffering that made it possible. We get to decide what we do with that inheritance, whether we remember honestly or selectively, whether we replicate the patterns or break them, whether we question the systems that produce both Carnegie and Homestead or accept them as natural and inevitable. The answer matters. Not for Carnegie. He's dead. Not for the workers at Homestead. They're dead too. But for the people working in warehouses and factories right now, in conditions that echo the past more than we'd like to admit. For the next generation who'll inherit whatever systems we build or fail to build. For anyone who wants to believe that human life has value beyond productivity, that dignity isn't a luxury afforded only after profits are secured. Carnegie believed in progress. So do most of us. The question is, what kind? Progress that enriches a few at the expense of many. Progress that builds monuments on mass graves, or progress that includes everyone, that values lives equally, that builds systems designed for human flourishing rather than maximum extraction. The choice isn't between progress and stagnation, it's between different visions of what progress means and who it serves. When you visit a Carnegie library, read the books he made accessible, learn, grow, benefit from the institution. But remember how it was funded. Remember who paid the real cost. Remember that every brick represents hours of brutalized labor. Every book represents wages not paid. Every program represents safety measures not implemented. And then decide what we build next. What institutions we create, what systems we design, what values we prioritize. We can't undo the past. We can't bring back the dead. We can't make Carnegie answerable for Homestead. But we can learn. We can do better. We can build a world where progress doesn't require blood, where wealth doesn't demand poverty, where success doesn't necessitate suffering. Or we can build more libraries and tell ourselves that's enough. That generosity excuses brutality, that the arc of history bends toward justice automatically without requiring us to bend it ourselves. That Carnegie was complicated but ultimately good, that Homestead was unfortunate but necessary, that everything worked out in the end so the means don't matter. The choice is ours. History is watching. The question is, what will we choose to remember?